Hey everybody, hopefully you're having a great week so far and everything's going smoothly for you. On this week's episode or segment of What's the Point, I want to take a look back at the text from this past Sunday that Justin taught on in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. So there's a very apparent theme here that the writer gives us, and that is the theme of time itself. Or as Justin so musically put it, time after time. So in verse 8, or rather the first 8 verses, we see what are some of the most well-known verses in Ecclesiastes. The writer creates this very beautiful poem that encompasses the idea that for everything in life there's a time or a season. And Justin pointed out that the way that these verses are written are not only meant to show that there's a time for one extreme or the other, but everything in between those two. So when we see verses like verse 2, it says there's a time to be born and a time to die. That also implies that there is a time to live that life in between those two. Or in verse 4, there's a time to weep and there's a time to laugh. There's a time for every emotion in between those. Then in the next section, verses 9 through 15, the writer tells us that though God has put the concept of eternity in our hearts, that we as humans can't actually comprehend and know all things that God has done or will do. Remember that Justin gave us this imagery of a parade, and the idea is that we only see the section of the parade in front of us, this small bit. That can be very easy for some people to accept, and then for other people very frustrating. But the good news is that the next few verses the writer points out that there's nothing better than to be joyful and do good and enjoy the fruits of our labor. The writer gives us this thought that even though God hasn't given us the understanding of eternity, that the pleasure to be gained from our toiling in this life is a gift from Him. Then in the last section, verses 16 through 22, we see the writer speaks on what feels like hopelessness and wickedness and injustice that plague the world that we live in. And as a quick aside here, we see that even in the time of writing this book, that the writer is contemplating similar thoughts and ideas about the world that we probably feel like in this day too. But it's important that even though we see injustice here and now, because that's the context that we live in, that we don't forget that the world has been broken since we left the garden. That way back in Genesis chapter 4, Cain killed Abel. Now it's because of that same evil that we call sin that verse 20 tells us that all people, like beasts, will die and return to the dust from which we came. But Justin perfectly reminded us that God took even the worst day and the most evil thing in human history and used it for our good and for His glory. When humanity encountered the perfection and purity of Jesus, we decided that we were going to beat Him, to nail Him to some wood, and then hang Him up in the air like a display of our depravity. But God used that evil to provide redemption and restoration to the same sinful people that committed it. And then in verse 17, we are reminded that at the end of all things, justice and judgment are the Lord's. So 2 major applications that we had from this. The first one is that we believe that the work of God will produce perspective, purpose, and patience in our lives. And the second one is, though we may not see it or understand it, that God's timing is always perfect, and He's proven it time and time again. So this Sunday morning coming up at 10 o'clock, we will continue our series through Ecclesiastes and pick up in chapter 4. We hope that you will join us there and have a wonderful week.